Good morning to Facebook. We will be starting in just a moment. We are waiting for a few more of our attendees to assemble. Hello, everyone on Facebook. We'll be getting started in just a moment. We're waiting for a couple more people to join the room. Hello again to our friends on Facebook. We'll be starting in just a moment. We're just waiting for a few more people to gather. Hello to everyone in the audience and on Facebook. We'll be starting in just a minute. We're just waiting for a couple more participants. Please bear with us for just 1 minute, please. Okay, I think we can get going this morning. Thank you all for joining us for this press conference about the petition that we are filing with the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. At the end of the comments by Brian Endless and attorney Peter Coharis, we will be opening up for questions. You can put your questions down at the bottom of your screen. There's a Q&A function. Please type the questions into the Q&A function and we'll answer them live. And without any further ado, Professor Brian Endless, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Kitty, and thank you all for joining us. As Kitty mentioned, my name is Brian Endless. I'm a faculty member at Loyola University Chicago and the Director of African Studies there. I've also worked with Paul Rusesabagina for 15 years now and have been working with his family and team during his imprisonment to try to get him home from Rwanda. I'm joined today by one of our lawyers working on the case, Peter Coharis, and also by Paul's daughters, Anais and Karine Kanimba. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. On August 28th, 215 days ago, Paul Rusesabagina was lured under false pretenses from his home in San Antonio, Texas to Dubai, where he was kidnapped and brought to Kigali, Rwanda against his will. Since that time, both the Rwandan agent who lured him, the president of Rwanda, the prosecutors, and various members of the Rwandan government have all confirmed that there was a plot to bring Paul Rusesabagina to Rwanda. And in the words of Rwandan President Paul Kagame, it worked, quote, flawlessly. What the Rwandan government doesn't tell you is that this plot was also entirely illegal. It qualifies as kidnapping under US and Rwandan laws and is illegal rendition under international law. No rules of law or proper procedures were followed, and because of that, Paul Rusesabagina is now a victim of arbitrary detention in Rwanda. We knew from the beginning that Paul would not get a fair trial, and this has been borne out over his 7 months in arbitrary detention. Paul Rusesabagina is a frequent critic of the human rights violations of President Paul Kagame and his regime, and Kagame has vowed to silence Paul on many occasions since the release of Hotel Rwanda in 2004. This has included harassment, threats against his life, raids on his house, and now has culminated in his kidnapping. Paul has now publicly refused to continue his participation in this show trial, in no small part because of his kidnapping, illegal rendition, and subsequent arbitrary detention, all of which make the entire process illegal from the start. In an effort to continue to show the world the unfairness of Paul's trial, and especially his arrest and detention, his family and legal team have filed a petition with the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and we are here to talk about that today. This joins a petition that we already filed with the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. We've been working with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Foundation in putting together this petition, and I want to thank them for their extraordinary efforts. And now, to discuss the petition in more depth, I'd like to introduce our lawyer who has been heading up this effort, Peter Coharis. Peter?
Thank you very much, Brian. As Brian mentioned, I'm an attorney based in Washington, D.C. I lead an international boutique law firm, and I'm also a board member of Freedom Now, which focuses on freeing people who have been arbitrarily detained. So some of you may or may not be familiar with a UN working group petition. Basically, somebody who has been arbitrarily detained, and that phrase means arbitrary against the rule of law or counter to due process rights, and detained means simply held and prevented from free movement or travel. So you can be arbitrarily detained as part of house arrest, you can be jailed and not charged, you can be jailed and subjected to a trial that takes place over many years, you can be jailed and never subjected to a trial at all. So it's a broad phrase, and it is intended to be broad to protect people against being held without against their rights and against international law. So the petitions set forth first a little bit about Paul, his background as a political opponent of the Kagame regime, and also about the Rwandan government currently and what it does to political opponents, its regular use of the courts to try to silence political opponents within the country, its use of other intimidation measures to silence people outside of the country, and then its regular denial of due process rights to those who have been subjected to the political opponents of the regime, who have been subjected to a judicial procedure in the country. And sadly, those measures include torture, as documented by several human rights organizations, coerced confessions, and also coercing witnesses to testify falsely against defendants. We filed, and my co-petitioners were the RFK Foundation, as Brian mentioned. We filed after what some lawyers refer to as exhausting local remedies. This is important to realize that we actually brought many of our complaints, and I'm not going to go through all of them on this call. You can read it in the petition. I'll just highlight the key ones. But we brought these complaints to the court in Rwanda and asked that the court address them. After the court denied our motions, pretrial motions that bled into during the trial motions, it was then that we were forced or compelled to file the petition, because it was then clear that we simply were not going to receive a free and fair trial. So what are some of the highlights of the petition? Well, the working group has different categories of violations, and you can bring claims for violation of your due process rights under different categories. I won't go through the technicalities of that right now, but here are three main components. One, the court lacked proper jurisdiction. It kidnapped Paul under international law. Yes, it was also under US law and under Rwandan law, but for purposes of the working group's definition, it kidnapped Paul under international law, and it did so without an arrest warrant. The government referred on several occasions in interviews to an international arrest warrant. It's never produced an international arrest warrant. It certainly didn't produce one in the United States when it lured Paul out of the United States, and the UAE, the Dubai part of the UAE affirmed that it was never presented with an arrest warrant. No criminal proceedings whatsoever. He was just a a passenger on a flight. So this notion that there was an arrest warrant, it seems to have been a fiction. And some of you will recall the United States has deportation proceedings, and the United States has successfully deported several Rwandans back to Rwanda to face criminal proceedings when the Rwandans comply with US law and seek deportation. The fact that they didn't do that in this case tells you all you need to know about the evidence they have against Paul, because the standard of proof in a deportation proceeding is substantially lower than it would be in a criminal proceeding. At any rate, we filed the petition, and in addition to a lack of jurisdiction that the criminal court in Rwanda had, we highlighted several other things, including that Paul has been denied his counsel of choice. Initially, he was denied his local counsel of choice, and the Rwandan authorities insisted upon him using Rwandan from a list of Rwandan attorneys. It took considerable effort and intervention on the part of the US State Department and the Belgians and the international community before the Rwandans finally relented and allowed him to use local counsel of his own selection or choosing. But by then, significant amount of time had passed, and I think the local counsel was only able to meet with Paul 8 times before the trial started, which is insignificant. There are other problems. He's not still to this day allowed to use international legal counsel, including me. And that's against Rwandan past practice. There's no reason to exclude us. Doesn't mean we would be standing up in court and making objections. Obviously, there's a language barrier, but we would be there to provide legal counsel and also make sure that international norms of due process and fairness are adhered to. And if they're not, to make note of that and to object and to bring other objections through local counsel. So he's been denied international counsel. Some of the other just very disturbing things, his attorney-client, remember, we've only been able to meet in person about 8 times, his local counsel. His attorney-client privileged papers have been confiscated, and there's no debate about that. The government has admitted that publicly and in court proceedings, and the court ordered them to return the papers to Paul. But it didn't stop the fact that new or additional papers would also be confiscated, and it did nothing to unscramble the egg that they've already seen and reviewed strategic and other sensitive documents sent by Paul's lawyers to Paul. This is a grave violation of Paul's due process rights, as you can imagine. In addition, he's been subjected to conditions that are not appropriate and are inhumane, and are also a violation of his rights. We've not been able to review case files, 5,000 pages before trial. The trial has already started. So how in the world do you attend a trial and review thousands and thousands of pages and confer with your client and prepare to cross-examine government witnesses all at the same time? And it's nonsensical, and it prevents any kind of free and fair trial. So where do things stand now? Well, the Rwandan government technically has the opportunity to respond to our petition, and perhaps they will. It's impossible to tell. Oftentimes governments don't, and I think this is going to be a very difficult set of facts for them to try to counter, because we do, I think, if I dare say, hundreds of footnotes corroborating all of the allegations that we make. Or they can simply ignore the petition, and then the UN working group will issue a report. It's impossible to say what will happen. We're told now that the trial will last at least 3 to 4 months. Perhaps it will, perhaps it won't, in which case that might be that the working group has enough time to issue a report before the end of the trial or shortly afterward. Again, I can't predict that. But it also leaves us in a couple of other places, not only legally, but also diplomatically with the State Department. As some of you know, the State Department has publicly been calling on the Rwandan government, as has the Belgian ministry, to provide a free and fair trial for Paul. And we have now privately and now publicly called upon the State Department to stop doing that, because it is clear that his due process rights have been denied, and you can't unscramble the egg. The judge can't simply wave a magic gavel on the last day of trial and suddenly make everything free and fair. Those rights have been violated. They can't be restored. and the idea that a free and fair trial is possible no longer exists. So we've asked the State Department to stop calling upon the Rwandan government to provide something that simply cannot be provided any other. And we also continue to ask the State Department to ask for his immediate humanitarian release. You don't need to finish a trial to have a humanitarian release. You don't need to have an appeal to have a humanitarian release. You can call upon the Rwandan government to do so now, and we've asked the State Department to do that. And for that, let me stop and maybe we can answer some questions if there are any.
One of the first questions, Peter, I think you kind of already answered it, but maybe you can elaborate. What's the Biden administration position on the abduction of Paul Rusesabagina? And maybe in your answer, you can also talk a little bit about what Congress's position is as well.
Sure. So I have no doubt, and I should mention, I've been working very closely with some people in the State Department. Ambassador Peter Vrooman, who's the U.S. ambassador to Rwanda, has been extremely focused on this issue, even going so far as to personally attend some of the trial, which is an extraordinary thing for a U.S. ambassador to do, but to signal U.S. attention to this matter. And Ambassador Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, and I have been working very closely as well. And we have now a new Acting Assistant Secretary of Africa, Bob Godick, who is also very much apprised of this situation. That's the good news. Everybody is on the same page in terms of wanting Paul to return home safely and to be kept safely in Rwanda. And we did get some good news that he did receive his first COVID shot, which is extremely important because the prison system is rife with COVID right now. So that's the good news. The bad news, and by the way, I should mention, and Anais can tell you, she spoke directly to Secretary Blinken on a call with many other families that he did very early during his tenure as Secretary of State, talking to hostage families, U.S. families of hostages being held overseas. So I have no doubt of the sincerity and commitment of the Biden administration in terms of Paul's safety and security and trying to get him home. What I would simply ask is that they start to publicly ask for his humanitarian release and to really put greater pressure on an immediate release and not have to wait 3 or 4 months, because as many of you on this call know, Paul is suffering substantial medical ailments, and he's a cancer survivor. He has preconditions and health conditions, including very high blood pressure, which has been extremely high in the prison. The family is deeply concerned, and Corinne and Anais can speak more about that if you would like, why they're so concerned about his health and safety. With respect to Congress, there the support has been even greater. We had, thanks to several people on the call, we organized a joint bicameral, bipartisan letter, House and Senate foreign policy leadership, ranking members and chairs of all the major committees, calling last December, 37 members plus an additional 38th member wrote her own separate letter, which mirrored many of the concerns expressed in the other letter. But 38 members in total, House and Senate, calling for the immediate humanitarian release of Paul, and also expressing their deep concern about the circumstances of Paul's abduction from the United States. They're very much realized if a former Presidential Medal of Freedom winner, about whom a movie's been made and who's a global humanitarian figure, can be kidnapped from the United States, who else can be kidnapped from the United States? And the State Department has to address this very dangerous precedent of having countries kidnap Americans and not taking extreme measures to get him back immediately. And that's the import of the letter. And the Congress, I think, will be coming out with more support and more statements and actions in support of Paul's immediate release shortly.
Corinne, could you also update us briefly about what's happening on the European side in the Belgian Parliament and the European Parliament and with the Belgian State Department? Because as people who've been following the trial know, we've been in a bit of a dance with people waiting for Belgium to act, Belgium waiting for the US to act, and vice versa. So Corinne, can you bring us up to speed?
Yes, so as most of you know, the European Union on February 11th voted in favor of a resolution condemning Rwanda for the enforced disappearance, the treatment, and the illegal detention of my father. They asked for an investigation into the legality of his arrest, and that if in fact the Rwandans cannot prove that he was legally arrested, that he be released immediately. We are waiting to see where this investigation is at the moment, but the support of the entire European Union is really telling and has been very helpful to our advocacy. In Belgium, in the Belgian Federal Parliament, there is a resolution has been introduced by Deputy Els van Hoof and is currently being discussed among the parliamentarians. We have received a lot of support from various members of parliament, from various groups, and we will continue to advocate on his behalf in order for the resolution to pass.
Peter, you may have said this and I may have just missed it, but what actually happens once the United Nations has the petition and looks at it? I know we have to wait for Rwanda to respond, but then what? What can we actually expect?
Yeah, Rwanda has the option of responding. Many countries, in fact, don't respond. They for either because they choose not to, because they don't have the resources, or they don't respect the working group, or they realize there's nothing to be said. They can't defend their behavior, and they can't defend their actions and conduct and their violations of due process and human rights. So it'll be interesting to see what the Rwandan government does. If it chooses not to respond, then usually the UN will act fairly quickly to try to address the petition and then issue some kind of report or statement about the allegations, whether it substantiates them or not. Unfortunately, the UN is suffering from some major backlogs. All UN agencies are right now, both in terms of investigating and reporting. The budget isn't there, and the personnel, the number of the caseload has just really increased dramatically over the last few years as more and more people have discovered the working group and have sought its assistance. So how long this will take, I don't know. I'm hopeful that it'll be a matter of a small number of months rather than a long number of months.
Okay. Do we have any more questions from the audience? You can put it in the Q&A function and we'll wait for just a second. Anais, did you want to give any updates while we're waiting for another question?
Yes, I'd like to add a little bit on my dad's health condition, current health condition. You know, our family is still very, very concerned and worried about his medication situation. On our last phone call, which we cherish a lot, he still mentioned that he has really high blood pressure and he's dizzy. And so this is an indication that the current medication he's receiving in Rwanda are not working. And I want to remind you all that, you know, our family sent his medication 6 months ago in September, and the Rwandan authorities have decided not to give him his medication, but to give him their own medication, which are not working. And my dad has really, really high blood pressure, and it has not gone down in the last few weeks, as Peter mentioned. So we would love to, again, make sure that the international community and of course the UN also looks at these unhumane condition of detention.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions from the audience. I'm going to give everyone one last chance. And then panelists, if you could stay on for a moment, and with no further questions, we can say goodbye to our Facebook audience and thank you all for attending. If you signed up, you'll have the petition in your inbox. If you don't get it, it's also available on the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Foundation website, and it will be available on the Hotel Rwanda Free Rusesabagina website later today, and you can always email us and ask us for a copy. Thank you very much for joining us today. Kevin, if you could please sign us off from Facebook.